Folks, welcome to Isolation Bible Study. I'm Bill Tucker from Concordia with Pastor Zach McIntosh. And on Mondays during this summer series on the book of Numbers, we have been using Monday to circle back to the message and talk about some extra points. There's always more that we could talk about, even when we're doing adult Bible class and preaching. There are still more points, more things, more in the text than we could possibly cover. And that is certainly true as we've been digging into the book of Numbers. But yesterday was kind of a neat landmark for Concordia and for one of our pastors.
Yeah, it was. So Pastor Paul Horstmeyer was ordained this past Sunday, so 1 week ago on Sunday. And so then this Sunday, he has to take his first round out of the gate officially as a pastor. And so he was the one who preached a great message on Numbers chapter 20. And so he gave us plenty of food for thought, and we've been kind of thinking through a couple of extra things. And so we'll be kind of building on some of the work that he began yesterday.
So can I remind you, if you're on Facebook, like and share this page on Facebook. It increases the viewership and lets folks know that we're here and available. And if you can do that if you're on the Concordia site as well, let folks know, invite them to be a part of Isolation Bible Study, because, as we do this, one of the things we're trying to ascertain is, does it engage enough folks to justify the time that's involved to continue this as we go forward, and especially as school gets started, and we're all from you and me to everybody in the church staff very much involved in supporting the school reopening and in-person classes and so forth. We really have to be good stewards of time, and so that's one of the things we're trying to figure out is this the best use of time? And at some point, it really does involve having people who are participating and figuring out what that looks like. And so we'd appreciate your helping us and passing the word along and sharing it as we continue through. So Zach, why don't we jump in and kind of recap the section in Numbers that we talked about yesterday with Pastor Paul, and then we'll jump into the points.
That sounds great. I'll just begin by reading the story. Now, the great thing about Numbers is that it has a lot of really cool stories, and this is another really cool story. It's a story about how Moses gets water out of a rock. And so here's what we read in church yesterday. This is from Numbers 20, beginning at verse 2. Now there was no water for the community, and the people gathered in opposition to Moses and his brother Aaron. Aaron's the high priest, and they quarreled with Moses. And they said, "If only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. Why did you bring the Lord's community into this wilderness that we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to this terrible place? It has no grain or figs, grapevines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink." And so the Israelites are complaining. The Israelites are professional complainers. That's pretty much all they do. And so this is no surprise. And so,
well, know, Zach, though, what's interesting is as you read that first section, it's a little bit like our current circumstance. Politicians from the president to the governors to mayors, and in our case, county judges, are facing all kinds of heat based upon how well things are going with the coronavirus and infection rates and death rates and all that kind of stuff. So we have a little bit of understanding, because when things go wrong, we tend to get really upset and we start pointing toward our leaders.
That's exactly right. And the Israelites are basically doing what human beings have been doing and human beings still do even today. Now the question is not just how Moses is going to respond. The question is how God is going to respond. And here's how God responds. This is verse 7. The Lord said to Moses, "Take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock." So there's a rock there before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. You will bring water out of the rock for the community, so they and their livestock can drink. And then verse 10, he and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock?" Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with a staff. Water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land that I give to them." And so here's kind of the basic gist of the story. God says, "I want you to speak." Moses says, "Okay, I'll speak, but I'm not going to speak to a rock. I'm going to speak and yell at a bunch of Israelites, and then I'm going to hit the rock because I'm just angry with the situation." And God says, "Bad choice." because of what you've done, that promised land that you've been kind of working for and traveling toward, you're not going to get to enter it with some other folks.
Well, and for the sake of context, one of the things you mentioned, so they've been working toward getting to the promised land. If you remember way back when the spies went into the promised land and they looked around, they came back, and the Israelites doubted God's protection for them, doubted his ability to help them conquer the Holy Land. And so God said, okay, you don't trust me? You don't want to follow me? You're going to wander around for 40 years in the wilderness. And now when we get to this story, that 40 years is almost up. So most of the original Israelites, that first generation, have died. The majority of the people here who are grumbling and talking about pomegranates and all of these kind of things, they've never tasted one. They've never seen one. They've never even set foot in Egypt. And it's kind of interesting to think about this because it's not the same group of people. This is primarily the children of the people who have been doing all the grumbling all along through the book of Numbers.
But the past always has a nostalgia to it that the future never does. And they just cannot let go of what they thought they had. And you know how this goes, right? How big does the fish get with time? It always gets bigger. How good does Egypt get with time? It always gets better, no matter how terrible it really actually was.
And that really kind of underlines something that's implicit in this. And that is, every time these people have been grumbling throughout the book of Numbers, every time they've been mad at Moses, every time they've been doubting God, they've been talking to their kids and talking about, oh, in Egypt, the fruit was amazing. Oh, in Egypt, we had it so good. And so they've imprinted on their kids this whole optimism from the past.
And you know what? All it does is it keeps them from their future, quite literally. And so 3 points, and the first one actually kind of plays off of this, which is this. Just because it was doesn't mean it is. Now, I know that's kind of a weird way to state a point, so let's see if I can try to tease this out a little bit, okay? So the story that we just read in Numbers 20, where God says to Moses, I want you to speak to a rock and water is going to come out of it. This is not the first time that Moses has gotten water out of a rock. In fact, if you back up to the beginning of their time in the wilderness, this is way back in Exodus 17, the Israelite community, Exodus 17, verse 1, when they set out from the desert of sin, they traveled from place to place as the Lord commanded. And then verse 2 of Exodus 17, what are they doing? They're quarreling with Moses and they say, give us water to drink. Or verse 3, they say, why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst? In other words, this has been 40 years worth of grumbling and griping and complaining. And so what does God do? Well, there's a rock there. Okay. And God says to Moses in verse 6, I'm going to stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. And then notice God's specific instruction. He says, strike the rock and water will come out of it for the people to drink. And so you back up to the beginning of the story of the Exodus, and the people want water. God gets it out of a rock. And how does God tell Moses to get out of the rock? Strike the rock. You fast forward to Numbers 20, and the people want water out of a rock. And how does God say to Moses to get the water out of the rock? Speak to the rock. But here's what Moses doesn't do. He doesn't take the time to listen to God anew. He just figures, well, it worked 40 years ago, so it'll work right now. Now, golly, how many of us do that all the time? It worked such and such a time, so it'll work right now. It worked 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 40 years ago. And so obviously nothing has changed. I don't need to take any time to listen to God anew. I don't need the time to take into consideration my current context to get the latest and best advice. Whatever worked in the past, whatever was, obviously can be what is. That just isn't true. And in this story, we see how dangerous that can actually be.
You know, I think about that even just in terms of reading the word, how, you know, we can get into this pattern where we say, well, I've read the Bible. I've read the Bible in the past. But the Bible is living and active. It's alive. And so reading it opens new things to us every single time we read it. One of the things that I've loved about this series is the fact that even though I've been through Numbers more than once, as we're digging into this and preparing to preach and teach on it, there are all kinds of things that jump up in a fresh new way, and all kinds of things that I've really never paid attention to before. So, for example, the reality that this is a whole different generation of people who are grumbling. I'd never thought about that in the previous readings, but then here it is right in front of us, and it brings to light something. And by the way, it brings to light to me what kind of nostalgia, toxic nostalgia, am I passing along to my own kids, passing along to the generation behind me, because I'm not willing to look afresh at the truth of my reality.
Part of the reason that I think this story is so incredibly relevant in this moment is because this is exactly where we find ourselves in the middle of COVID-19. You mentioned school a few minutes ago. We're basically having to rethink pretty much everything.
In many respects, it feels like we're starting from scratch with so much of what we have to do. And it may be temporary. It could be for the whole year. Who knows?
But if we're not willing to do that, the consequences could be disastrous. And so here's kind of one way to think about this. I've heard this said in several different places. As the church, as the people of God, we have a mission. And the mission does not change, right? The mission is to reach the lost, to make disciples of folks. Those are our marching orders. But the methods, those change. The mission of our school, for example, that hasn't changed. We want to reach kids with the good news of Jesus. We want to give them a well-rounded education, right? Because God has given us a ton to learn. But the methods that's going to work with, those are going to change a little bit this year. And so one of the ways to keep yourself from getting freaked out when everything feels uncertain is to realize that our mission is rock solid. The mission of God to get the children of Israel through the wilderness, that hasn't changed. That's why they can get water out of a rock at the beginning of the Exodus and water out of a rock at the end of the Exodus. He wants to care for his people, protect his people because he loves his people. All of that is rock solid. But when the methods change, as long as the mission is the same, we have nothing to freak out about, because you know what? The same God who was with us 40 years ago is still with us today.
And that's at the heart of every single one of the grumbling. So a little sneak preview of next week's message. This grumbling didn't start in Numbers, as you indicated and shared just a minute ago. It goes all the way back to Exodus. It goes all the way back to the beginning of Moses' ministry. After God calls him, even before they leave Egypt, the people of Israel begin to complain because Pharaoh is upset when Moses first approaches him. And it always goes back to the same theme. They're not willing to trust God. They're not willing to follow God as he leads through Moses, and it leads to disastrous consequences.
So just one other quick kind of theological point on this point. If you just read the Bible itself, you see this in spades. So let's take the Old Testament, okay? What is God's mission? Well, he wants to redeem his people. He wants to forgive his people. He wants to rescue his people. He wants to save his people because they've fallen into sin. So how does God do that in the Old Testament? Well, he does it with a sacrificial system, right? Because the mission is to save his people. Well, are people still sacrificing goats in their backyards today? No. Why? Because the great sacrifice, the one sacrifice, has come. But is the mission the same in the Old Testament as it is in the New Testament? Yes. Even if the sacrifice has changed, and quite frankly, gotten a whole lot better because Jesus is the sacrifice to end all sacrifices, the mission remains the same. And so we see it in the Bible. And so I guess the invitation would be, don't worry about that in your life. If you got to make changes on the fly, that's okay. There's no reason to get shaken up about it. It'll serve you a lot better if you learn how to change methods with time while also fixing your eyes on the mission that Jesus has given you.
Well, and it goes back to what we've talked about so many times, Zach, about establishing a track record with God. So being in his word, being faithful in prayer, having accountability groups, being a person who tests God in tithing as he invites us. All of those things, all of those spiritual disciplines and more lead to this sense, this awareness that God is faithful, that we can trust him in all of these various things in our life, so that when we have to make a change, when we have to make a shift on the fly, when we're sort of out in a place where we've never been before and maybe aren't very comfortable, at least we have confidence that the rock we're standing on, that the truth we're standing on, the God we're counting on can be trusted.
And so that's point number one. Just because it was doesn't mean it is. And you know what? That's the way all of life works. And so we can roll with that while still knowing that we have a trustworthy God. Okay, so here's point two. Faith without deeds is dead. Now, just so you know, I didn't make up that point by myself. I just ripped it off from the Bible.
Oh, I thought it was just a popular song.
Exactly. So this is James 2 verse 26, where James literally says, faith without deeds is dead. But then here's the flip side to that. Okay. Faith without deeds is dead, but deeds without faith, that's actually deadly.
That is such a Zacchaean turn.
But let me try to explain it, because this is critical. This is absolutely critical, because this goes to the heart of Moses's problem. Okay. Moses thought that he knew how to get everything taken care of. He thought he knew exactly what he was doing. He thought he knew how to do the deed, make the water come out of the rock. Okay. He had the deeds. He had the works. He knew how to get water out of that rock. The problem
even
was,
says so.
Yeah.
Must we bring water from the rock, is what he says.
So he thought he had it all tied up. The problem was that he didn't listen to God, because in some way or another, his faith in God, he was so frustrated. His faith in God was lagging. It was diminishing. It was breaking, which is why finally, and Pastor Paul did a great job bringing this out in his message. In Numbers 20, verse 12, when God finally comes to Moses and Aaron, he doesn't say, hey, you've done the wrong deed. You've done something wrong. He says to them, you did not trust in me enough. In other words, you didn't have faith in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites. Ultimately, the problem that Moses has is that he has this deed without faith. So back to James for just a second. In James 2 verses 17 and 18, James has this great line where he says, in the same way, faith by itself, if not accompanied by action, if not accompanied by deeds, is dead. But James continues, this is verse 18, someone will say, you have faith and I have deeds. And I love the challenge that James issues. He says, okay, fine. Show me your faith without deeds. And by the way, here's what's implicit in that statement. I bet you can't, because there's no such thing. Just show me your faith without deeds, but I'll show you my faith by my deeds. And here's what James is getting at. The real danger here is not that someone's going to have faith without deeds. That's impossible. If you have faith in God, it's always going to overflow into something that you do. It's hand in glove. It's the way it works. The real danger is that you might just have deeds without faith. You might just think you can take care of it all by yourself, and you're not going to listen to God. You're not going to trust in God, and that can lead to disaster. And that's what Moses is struggling with.
Yeah, great point and powerful point, that this whole issue of faith, that it's faith that makes all the difference. It's faith, and for our faith, that Jesus died, that we might be reconnected with God, reestablishing that relationship that we desperately need by faith.
And so very practically, again, this is something that a lot of people who are even Christians sometimes struggle with, but also a lot of people who have big questions about faith, they struggle with it too, because somehow they've gotten it in their minds that Christianity is really about what they do more than about who they believe. And they figure, hey, as long as I have enough deeds, right? As long as, I have enough good stuff on my balanced ledger, as long as I can bring enough water out of a rock, man, then I'm good to go. Then God has to say, okay, you've done the right stuff. But that's not ultimately what God wants. Ultimately, what God wants is for a person to trust in him and in his son, Jesus Christ, for a person to have a relationship with him, which is only established by faith. And you can be the best person in the world, but if you have deeds without faith, you have the wrong starting point, because quite frankly, that's never how you develop a relationship with someone. When we're born to our mom, to our dad, all we have to offer them is faith that they're going to take care of us. When we make vows on our wedding day, all we have to offer to that person is a promise, right? We actually have faith that, when they say I do to us and we say I do to them, that they're actually going to keep their promise. Every relationship starts with faith, and our relationship with God is no different. It cannot just be established by what we do.
Isn't it interesting to think about how we were talking a moment ago about the nostalgia of the past, right? And essentially the nostalgia of our sinful past. How it is that in contrast, faith creates a hope-filled future. Our sin, our past can't do that, but faith does. It creates this beautiful possibility for the future in marriage as in relationship to God.
And so that's the second problem. Ultimately, Moses' problem is a faith problem. It's not just that he does the wrong thing. It begins with just an unwillingness to listen to God, an unwillingness to have faith that God, if you can imagine this after 40 years, still doesn't quite know what he's talking about.
Well, and one more little thing that I want to point out. This is just something for everybody to think about. Because God's comment to Moses and Aaron is, because you did not trust in me enough to do what? To honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites. I really think, as I was reading this and thinking about it yesterday, it really, our lives need to promote, to demonstrate our trust in God and his honor and his holiness in the sight of other people. And that goes to the whole idea of James, right? If we say we have faith, but it doesn't change the way we live, it doesn't change the way we act, it doesn't change the way we talk, well, wait a minute, something's wrong. And God could just as easily say to us, you don't trust me because you're not willing to honor me as holy in the sight of the people around you. So I think there's a really important call to live out that faith by example.
So here's the question then that we need to ask. What if you're watching today, or maybe you're watching a little bit later, and you go, well, quite frankly, I kind of struggle with faith. I'm kind of like Moses, where, I'm angry at somebody, or maybe I'm angry at God, and I'm not really sure I want to listen to him or believe in him or trust in him or any of that stuff. Well, here's the final lesson, which is this: God calls faith-challenged people back. So one word that I want you to pick up on in Numbers 20, verse 12, when God speaks to Moses and Aaron, he says, because you did not trust in me, and then here's the word, enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land that I give them. Okay, so Moses didn't trust in God enough to do the right thing in that moment. Okay, that's very clear from this story. Here's the question. Did he trust in God enough to receive anything from God? And the answer is absolutely, unequivocally. Even though he was faith challenged, he still trusted in God. And ultimately, he still received, honestly, something much better than a plot of land in the Middle East from God. He received an eternal inheritance from God. So there's this really interesting line in Hebrews 11, verse 16, that talks about how all the people of old were longing for a better country. In other words, the promised land was kind of like the promised partial land. Okay, it's the apartment complex that you live in for a while, but it's not your forever home. They were longing for a better country, the preacher of Hebrews says, a heavenly one, and that Moses still got. He missed the dirt, but he got the reward, because even though he had a faith challenged moment, even though he didn't trust in God enough to do the right thing in that moment, he still trusted in God enough to receive from God what God had promised. Because here's the thing: God can do amazing things with the weakest faith.
And Moses is a classic example, not even just in this moment, but all throughout. I mean, what happens here and what I would suggest blinds Moses and causes his lapse in faith is his anger problem. And this isn't the first time that Moses has demonstrated an anger problem. That goes all the way back to when he first left Egypt, because he got so mad he killed somebody, and then he was on the run. And so this anger issue blinded him, and yet that's not how God characterizes Moses. It's not something that prevents God from loving him. And even after Moses is gone, God continues to honor Moses as a great and faithful servant and leader, because God's focus isn't on our brokenness. He's taking care of our brokenness. He has a plan for that, and he knows exactly how he wants to solve that to reunite us with himself. God's focus is on how are you going to live? Because when we think about Ephesians 2:10, he has a masterpiece plan for our lives, not just for Moses' life, for all of our lives. How are we going to live that out? Well, only by faith.
So if you're watching and you are struggling with faith, here's the thing that I want you to know. God can do something with your broken faith. So it's interesting. If you fast forward to the New Testament, there's this great line. This is from 1 Corinthians 10. In the Apostle Paul, he's a church planter in the New Testament, and he actually writes about the story of the Exodus. And he actually writes about this story from Numbers 20. And here's what he says. He says, I don't want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud. That's a cloud that led them through the wilderness by day. And they all passed through the sea. That's the story of the Red Sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink. And then check this line out. For they all drank from the same spiritual rock that accompanied them. That's that story from Numbers 20, where Moses brings water out of a rock. And then he says, and that rock was Christ. Now, here's what's fascinating about what Paul says, okay? Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 4, that they had this spiritual rock that accompanied them. Now, I'll geek out for just a second here. New Testament written in Greek, and the New Testament Greek word for this word accompanied is the word akalotheo, and it means to follow someone. Now, here's the thing. When Jesus asks us to be his disciples, what does he say to us? He says, akalotheo me, right? Jesus says in Matthew 10, verse 38, take up your cross and follow akalotheo me. Well, here's what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 4. It turns out that not only do we follow Christ, but Christ follows us. When our faith is broken, when our faith is weak, he chases us around all through the wilderness saying, I want you to be my son. I want you to be my daughter. Your faith may be broken. It may be weak. You may feel like you're falling apart. You may have big questions, but just like I'm calling you to follow me, I'm going to practice what I preach. I'm going to follow you. There was a spiritual rock, Jesus, who was chasing Israel all the way through the wilderness because that's how much God loves them. And he'll chase you all the way through the wilderness of your life because that's how much he loves you too.
Great study, Zach, and great additional points from the message this weekend. Folks, we appreciate you joining us for Isolation Bible Study. Time is up, but I hope you have a great rest of the afternoon and a wonderful week ahead. God bless you all.